Hi, this is Kara Kozet, and I am going to continue on with conducting the environmental review. An early start is important. Ensures decisions reflect environmental values and avoids project delays and heads off potential conflicts. Some procedural reasons are the grantee may not commit HUD funds on an activity prior to the request for release of funds approval, and grantee may not commit non-HUD funds prior to the request for release of approval if the activity or project would have an adverse environmental impact or limit choice. The environmental review record must be submitted to DCEO's environmental review officer within 90 days of the date of the NOSAF, like any other special grant condition specified in the NOSAF. State Historic Preservation Office delays. We are very aware that due to some staffing issues and of COVID-19, the SHPO and IDNR is often taking over 30 days to process Section 106 clearance requests for our projects. Both state and federal law give the SHPO a 30-day clock to process the request. We have consulted with HUD and our general counsel and the IDNR agency director and have instituted a new policy. If it has been 45 days since you have sent proper Section 106 information to the SHPO for their initial review and have not received a response, please notify Kirk Kumaro, myself, Kara Kozad, or Dave Gobin. Once DCEO is notified, we will provide a waiver from SHPO clearance. This DCEO waiver letter will be utilized in the ERR in place of the SHPO's Section 106 clearance letter. If the SHPO re-enters the review after DCEO's waiver letter, the community has no obligation to comply. This policy does not eliminate the need for HUD tribal consultation. The State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, now only accepts electronic submissions, and this is the website. Now we're going to talk about costs of performing the review. If activity delivery is budgeted, the grantee may reimburse the environmental review record preparation costs from activity delivery. If a formal mitigation cost is incurred during the environmental review prep, for example, a Phase 1 archaeological survey, or they come across a Franklin ground squirrel as an example, that grantee may reimburse from construction or housing rehabilitation funds as applicable. Who does what? You must use an experienced environmental specialist as spelled out in the guidebook in Section 2. The specialist may prepare supporting documentation, but the responsible entity must independently evaluate their work and prepare the environmental review itself. So CEO signatures on the HUD, DCEO, and ERR forms must be completed. Correspondence to interested tribes and public notices must be sent under the responsible entity's signature and on its letterhead. So a specialist should never address the tribes directly, and a specialist should not sign or address public notices. That is the responsible entity's job. So here's part of the compliance documentation that's sent in with the environmental. This is just an example of what we do not want to accept. We don't want people to just write NA. We will not accept that. It's not allowed and it's not appropriate. Okay, so if we are adding funds or changing activities, we need to update the environmental review record. Reevaluation of a project is required when new activities are added, unexpected conditions arise, or substantial changes are made to the nature, magnitude, or extent of the project. If original environmental finding is still valid, just update the ERR with a new project description and funding amount and a CEST or EA documentation. Send a new request release of funds with changes to DCEO and no publication or waiting period for new environmental release letter is needed. If the original environmental finding is no longer valid or a project significantly has changed, the responsible entity must prepare new reviews and proceed with approval process from us. Request release funds, then you publish or you post, and then you'll receive an environmental release. Now we're going to talk about tiered review, which only has to do with housing rehabilitation. So you begin the CDBG housing review when the NOSAF is issued. The project area is identified, but specific addresses are unknown at that time. So it's a two-step process. So the Tier 1, you will have the CEST project area-wide review, and then you'll move on to the Tier 2, the CES2 home-specific review once you identify those homes that are going to be rehabbed. It's best suited for the CEST projects such as scattered site single family. The housing rehab tiered CES projects cannot convert to exempt. There will always be a notice of intent, request for release funds, publication or posting for Tier 1. So continuing on with the tiered review for housing rehabilitation, the Tier 1 is area-wide where your addresses are unknown and it's a reasonable geographic area. Your answers as many factors in the environmental review as feasible. So for CDBG housing rehab, 12 of the 16 bodies of federal law are answered in that Tier 1. And as we move on to Tier 2, it becomes site specific. So now you do know your address of the homes that are going to be rehabbed. This is a separate environmental review record. Each home must have its own Tier 2 review complementing that blanket Tier 1. And it will cite the Tier 1 for all of the previously answered factors of 12 of 16, which is the bodies of federal environmental law. So this Tier 2 will then require you to answer the last 4 of the 16 bodies of federal environmental law. So let's say that again. Tier 1, you will do the first 12 bodies of environmental law, and Tier 2, you will do the remaining 4 of the 16 bodies of law. So continuing on with the tiered review, let's take a look of the bodies of law that will clear in Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 is airport hazards, coastal barriers, flood insurance, clean air, coastal zone, endangered species, explosive and flammable hazards, farmland protection, floodplain management, sole source aquifers, wetlands protection, and wild and scenic rivers. For Tier 2, the 4 remaining bodies of law that need to be cleared is the contamination and toxic substance, historic preservation, noise abatement and control, and environmental justice. And continuing with the housing rehab tiered review, do I submit a request for release of funds? Yes, you absolutely do. You cannot convert any tiered reviews to exempt at the target area Tier 1 level. This means you must publish or post the notice of intent, request for release of funds as appropriate, stating it is a tiered review and identifying what aspects of the review will be evaluated at each level. 12 at Tier 1 versus 4 at Tier 2. Submit Tier 1 CEST ERR with the request for release of funds to DCEO, Housing Rehab Environmental Review Officer, for review. You will receive DCEO's Tier 1 environmental release letter that will be contingent upon completing Tier 2 reviews for each home being completed or approved prior to the award of the home's housing rehab contract. So let me state that again. The Tier 2 must be completed before signing that contract with that individual homeowner and that construction company that's going to do that work for that homeowner. So continuing on with housing rehab tiered review, when can you draw funds? For activity delivery costs and housing rehabilitation administration costs, otherwise known as inspection costs, you can draw that after DCEO's approval of the Tier 1 target and you have the executed grant agreement. For an individual home housing rehabilitation money, you can draw that after DCEO's approval of that Tier 2. So basically, after the Tier 1, blanket Tier 1, you can have activity delivery and inspection cash drawn. And then after that individual home's Tier 2, you could submit that to me, Kara Kozat, and I can send you an email approving the Tier 2, and then you can draw the housing rehab cash. So here are some implementing actions. So for all Illinois CDBG grants, The grantee must assure an environmental review decisions are carried out during the project development and implementation, and they establish binding commitments and enforce them. For example, construction rehab contracts must contain required mitigation language. Educate your contractors and workers on formal mitigation conditions, like if they see a copper belly water snake habitat in their migration routes. Let them know that this is something that we are always on the lookout for with the environmental process. Track or monitor implementation and update the environmental review record accordingly.